Seth last week talked about some ideas. Seth, right there, that guy, he also takes the offering, is a bull rider in his spare time and can ride a unicycle. But Seth last week was teaching, and he said some things that really hit home. In fact, all week long, I've just been thinking about some of these things, and it really sets us up for the text that we're going to be in tonight really well. And so I want to reiterate some of the things that he talked about. What he was talking about last week was how we get transformed. Like, first of all, he sort of addressed this thing, like, do we really change? Can we really change? Can our character change? Can our habits change? Can we be transformed as people? And then he began to share with us the way in which we are changed, like what shapes us, what actually influences who we become, and what adapts our character, what forms us as people. And there were three things that he mentioned that I just want to reiterate tonight. First one was this. He said it was the stories that we believe. Secondly, it was the habits that we develop. And third, it's the relationships that we cultivate. I don't know if that's specifically how he said it. That's how I wrote it in my notes. But it was the stories that we believe, the habits we develop, and the relationships we cultivate. In other words, the stories we believe, our culture, the scriptures, our families, they all tell stories. There's a narrative that's being told, and the stories that we believe to be true will influence us and the decisions that we make, and they will determine the direction of our life. We will make choices based on the stories, the narrative of our culture that we think is truest, that will define us. And then the habits we develop, the things we regularly participate in, those things eventually begin to shape us over time. Those things start to shape our character and who we are. And then finally, the relationships that we cultivate, the people that we hang out with, will influence us. Now, toward this end, I want to walk through a story tonight that if we believe this story is true, if this is one of the stories that we say there's some authenticity to this, there's truth to this, then I believe this story should impact us in fairly powerful ways. Like, if we choose to allow this to be one of the narratives that we believe is true, it has a significant impact on us. In fact, in a couple of different categories. Let me say this. If you came tonight and you are in a particularly complicated season in life, like you've got a variety of decisions to make, or maybe you find yourself dealing with anxiety, or you have choices, you don't know exactly which direction to go, you find yourself maybe just in a complicated time, I think what we're going to look at tonight is really relevant for where you're living. I'll also say this, if you're in a position where you have more questions than answers, I think this is a passage that's going to actually speak to some things in your own life. I would even say this, that if tonight you're here and you're just exploring faith, and that's something we love around Summit, is we just want this to be an environment where you can ask questions, and maybe you're asking questions about Jesus and who he is, and you're kind of wondering some things about what it means to be a Jesus follower. I think that tonight's going to surprisingly show you some things that will contradict maybe some assumptions that you've made about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So the story's going to be about Jesus, and it's going to challenge us as we look into it. Before we dive into it, I just want to come across or share something I came across this week as I was preparing for this. It was written about 100 years ago by this Canadian pastor, which I was like initially just kind of stunned. Like, good stuff comes from Canada, and just totally kidding. I've been taking shots at Canadians all day today, and they've been taking shots at me. But there's this Canadian preacher about 100 years ago. His name's James Francis, and he wrote several books. What I'm going to share with you is an excerpt from a sermon that he preached, and I think it's a really good way for us to set up where we're going with the text tonight. So just listen to what he said. Speaking of Jesus, he said, "Here is a man who was born in an obscure village as the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another obscure village. He worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30, and then for 3 years was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book, never held an office, never owned a home, never had a family, never went to college. He never put his foot inside of a big city. He never traveled 200 miles from the place he was born. He never did one of the things that usually accompany greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He had nothing to do with this world except the naked power of his divine manhood. While still a young man, the tide of popular opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. Another betrayed him. He was turned over to his enemies. He went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed upon the cross between two thieves. His executioners gambled for the only piece of property he had on earth while he was dying, and that was his cloak. When he was dead, he was taken down and laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 19 wide centuries have come and gone, and today he's the center of the human race and the leader of the column of progress. I am far within the mark when I say that all the armies that ever marched, and all the navies that were ever built, and all the parliaments that were ever sat, and all the kings that ever reigned, put together have not affected the life of man upon the earth as powerfully as this one solitary life. It's really good, right? And yet there's something interesting. When you hear this, you hear something that I probably hear, and that's that Jesus was incredibly unconventional. He was remarkably unconventional in the way that he did things. In fact, there's nothing in his story, there's nothing about all that I just read that would give you an indicator of the impact he would have on the world. Like, there's nothing in it. There are no predictors. There's nothing conventional about Jesus. There's nothing status quo about Jesus. It's not like Jesus was doing these things and then there were these leadership books or influence books that were being written during his day, and like Jesus was doing this stuff and people were like, oh yeah, no, he's been reading these books on leadership and so that's why he's throwing himself on a cross for people. Like, no, like there's none of it. Like, nobody ever said the way to change the world is to do the things or even not do the things that you're doing here. So why is this important? Why do we need to recognize this? It's important to recognize because stories like the one that we're going to be looking at tonight, they not only reveal the unconventional nature of Jesus, but I think it also challenges us to be unconventional in our discipleship to him. Like, if Jesus is that unconventional, if he's that different, that probably means his disciples are fairly unconventional in the way that they pursue him. Like, if this is true, then we're probably being asked to do far more than just think of Jesus in very conventional terms and follow him in very conventional sorts of ways. And by the way, if you're struggling, if you find yourself saying, you know, I get that there are these promises of Jesus and I understand that there are experiences that people should be having that follow Jesus, but they're not consistent with you. You say, that's not a reality for me. I'm not actually experiencing those things. Maybe the reason is that you're following a conventional Jesus of your own imagination in very conventional ways that work for you, rather than experiencing him in his unconventional nature. So this story we look at tonight, it's in Matthew chapter 14. And if you have a Bible, it can be on a device, or if you actually have one of those paper things that's called a Bible, you can open that up to Matthew chapter 14. Verse 22, if you want to take some notes tonight, there's going to be a few observations that we're going to make. Before I start walking through these verses, I want to just give you the context for what's happening, what happens before the story that we're looking at tonight. And the story before the story is actually one that we know, and a lot of us are familiar with it, because it's the story where Jesus is gathered on the shores of a lake, or shores of a small sea, and he's been teaching some people, and they're really hungry, and long enough hungry that they're probably a little hangry. It's getting towards the end of the day, and there's no food to feed these people, and then Jesus finds this little boy, the disciples find this little boy, and they bring him to Jesus, and he has some loaves and some fishes. How many of you have heard this story? Right, so kind of an amazing story where Jesus does something completely outside the box. He blows everybody's categories, and with he and his disciples, they just start distributing the food, and somehow when they're done, everybody among 5,000 people eats. Like, they all eat, and they're all happy, because people get happy when they eat. That's just like a normal thing, right? All people everywhere get happier when they eat. And so they feed everybody, and they're just like blown away. So people then, because they've never seen anything like this, and now they're experiencing the benefit of Jesus's unconventional nature, they begin to press in around he and his disciples. It's like they want more, not just food, but they want more of his teaching. They want more of his influence. They want more of this Jesus who's being shown to them. So when we pick up the story, it's immediately after these people have been fed, the loaves have been gathered up, there were actually leftovers, which is unbelievable. And then now we read this in verse 22 of Matthew 14. It says this. It says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, which, by the way, there is a very introverted part of who I am, and I love this part of who Jesus is, right? And those of you that are introverts, you probably go, yeah, that sounds really nice. Like, even tonight, I don't mind being at church for a little while, but I want to go be alone, right? And that's what Jesus does, right? He's like, I got to get out of here. And so he puts the disciples and sends them away in the boat, and then he goes, I've got to go spend some time away. I got to just like spend some time in prayer by myself. And we come to verse 24. It says, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them, and in the fourth watch of the night, let me just explain, in the fourth watch of the night, this is somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m., so this is in like the middle of the night, early morning hours, right? They're battling the waves. They're exhausted. So some of us have had nights like this, right? Where you've had to work on something through the night, or you've had to weather some sort of storm. Maybe you were camping. Maybe you had some sort of experience. Those of you that have had kids, maybe you've had a kid that was sick and you're just exhausted and the kid's not doing well in the middle of the night. You're just battling and there's that exhaustion. You're like, is this going to ever end? Will these kids ever grow up and leave my house? And the answer is yes, they eventually do. But you just, there's these nights that just seem like they will never end, and you're exhausted and you're battling. That's what's happening here. It's the fourth watch of the night and they're exhausted. And then it says in the next verse, it says, and he, speaking of Jesus, came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, it's a ghost. And they cried out in fear. And immediately Jesus spoke to them saying, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and he walked on the water and he came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. So Jesus immediately reached out his hand. He took hold of him, saying to him, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. Now, there are some observations that I think might challenge some of our thinking around Jesus that I want to make tonight as we start to unpack what's happening here. And the first thing I really want you to catch is this, that Jesus sends his disciples into the storm. Did you catch this? Jesus sent his disciples into the storm. Like, the disciples didn't choose to go for a boat ride. They were like, hey, you guys want to go for a row? And like, let's jump in the boat. And like, Jesus, you need some alone time. We're going to go like row the boat for a while and you can catch up with us later. No, it says immediately after the whole miracle of feeding people, Jesus put them in the boat and said, go, like you row off into the storm. Jesus sends them out. We're talking about Jesus doing this. I mean, I think about this whole scenario, I go, well, Jesus could have done any number of other things in this. Like, first of all, he could have just had them hold out and wait, right? Hey guys, I need some alone time. I'm gonna go spend some time praying up in the hills. I'll be back in a little while, and trust me, I'm stronger than all of you because I'm Jesus and I'll help you row, right? He could have done that. He could have just prayed for traveling mercies and a hedge of protection. That's what Christians do, right? You're going on a trip, you're gonna go row across the sea somewhere. You pray for traveling mercies and the seas get flat and everything gets good. Jesus could have done that, right? Because Jesus is Jesus, he could have parted the sea like Moses and they could have just walked on dry land, right? Could have done all of those things, but that's not what Jesus does. He puts them in a boat and he says, start rowing. And I want you to catch this. Jesus is perfectly comfortable with them being uncomfortable because of the storm. Do you see this? Like, he sends them out and he's comfortable with this. So it makes me want to ask this question. Does the Jesus that you follow do this sort of thing? Does the Jesus that you follow, your idea of who Jesus is, do you expect Jesus to push you off and be perfectly comfortable with you being in a storm and uncomfortable? Or is your conception of who Jesus is, the way you think of the Jesus you're following, the kind of Jesus who says, no, like I only send you out on smooth days. Like, in fact, for some of us, we would actually say the reason I follow Jesus is so I can avoid storms, right? Like, the whole point of me following you, Jesus, is because I don't want to be in these circumstances. And so it sort of confronts some of our thinking around who Jesus is. And could it be that in our effort to avoid the chaos, in our effort to avoid the storms and to only have flat, calm seas, that we're actually missing out on the unconventional ways of Jesus? He sends them directly into the storm, and then he goes to pray. That really makes me wonder about my own storms, my own situation. I mean, what if the situation I'm in, which by the way, just because I stand up here doesn't mean I don't have storms. Doesn't mean that there are scenarios where I feel very uncomfortable because of the circumstances of my life. And I know the same is for you, but think about the situation that you're in or that I'm in. Is God perfectly comfortable with the uncomfortable situation that I'm in? Like, what if God has me right here, right now, because he wants to show me something? Like, what if he isn't rescuing me from my situation, not because he doesn't love me, but because he wants me to see something about who he is, and the only way that's going to happen is in the middle of a storm? What if God's restraining himself and he's not delivering me from whatever storm I'm in, because ultimately what he cares about is doing something in me rather than simply doing something for me? I know this challenges all sorts of our thinking around who God might be. Like, well, if God is love, how is that loving, right? How is Jesus loving if this is what he's doing? Well, let me give you a couple reasons why this is loving. First of all, this is loving because Jesus has the power to calm the storm. If Jesus didn't have the power to calm the storm, this wouldn't be very loving, right? Hey guys, I want you to row out into the storm. You're going to learn some lessons, and by the way, you are completely outside of my control. Have fun with that, right? That's not very loving, but Jesus has control over the storm. So he sends them out into circumstances he has complete control over, and he proves that later. So Jesus is loving, and then he's still in control of the scenario. Secondly, Jesus knows what's best for us, and he does what's best for us. That's the definition of love. He knows what's best for us, and he still does what's best for us, even when that creates tension in our own hearts and our own thinking. Like Tim Keller, writing on that same concept, he says this. He says, if you have a God great enough and powerful enough to be mad at because he doesn't stop your suffering, you also have a God who's great enough and powerful enough to have reasons that you can't understand, and you can't have it both ways. There's an interesting note in this that in the Gospel of Mark, we actually read the same story in the Gospel of Mark. There's 4 biographies of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each one of those biographies are written from a little different perspective, and they really target a different audience. Mark is actually written from the perspective of Peter. Mark sort of transcribed Peter's story of who Jesus is. And so Mark includes some details that aren't included in the same story in Matthew chapter 14. And there's one particular thing that's really kind of crazy. When Mark tells this story, he says that when they were out in the storm and they're struggling, it says that Jesus was passing by them. Like it was an accident. Like they ran into each other out. Like those guys are rowing against the waves, and Jesus was like, and he's like, oh. And, they all like, Jesus, like, help. Like it's like this moment. So he describes them passing by, and it's like, okay, what in the world's going on? Is this sort of random that they bumped into each other in the storm on the sea? Or could there be more to this? It's really fascinating. That language of Jesus passing by